Thank you so very much to Thea for inviting me to be here with you today. It is an honor. I am just going to start by sharing a personal note to add to remembrances and recognitions that you have already eloquently spoken of. That today is also anniversary of the day when my home in Bosnia, in Bihać, Bosnia, was bombed. And it was very close to my own birthday. And so it's a very special day for me to be with you here today, also a very emotional day every year, as I remember those who did not survive the genocide and who were peers, friends, and family members. I am going to share some slides with you. As I speak of my work today, you will notice that I will focus on storytelling as a powerful pedagogical tool that allows us to reimagine resilience to hate. When I speak of resilience, I do not refer only to resilience as a coping mechanism that one uses to respond to trauma, tragedy, war, targeted violence meaning the kind of violence where individuals are targeted for their faith, for their ethnicity, for their race, or some other aspect of their identity. But this resilience that I will be talking about is a preventative resilience. How can we use diverse storytelling to build a sense of resilience that allows us to say no to hate, no matter who is targeted through hate-filled violence? And I will begin by reading from The Cat I Never Named. As I do want you to reflect on this question, and then we'll engage in a conversation. Why do you think that I had chosen to read this particular segment from The Cat I Never Named? And then we'll transition into a conversation and more discussion around my research and scholarship that connects to storytelling at Columbia University. So I will be reading from The Cat I Never Named, a scene, a moment where I find myself on the main bridge in my hometown. And the reason why I decided to cross this bridge that was quite dangerous because it was an open space when one could easily be targeted was because I heard that school would be in session. And I was a nerd. I was a math and physics nerd. I loved learning, and we couldn't learn in the midst of genocide. And so when I heard that school would be back in session, I decided to, without telling my parents, which I never recommend to children, to cross this bridge and go tell one of my closest friends that we would be in school again together. And then something happened. And that moment is one of many that changed my life forever. Then I hear a whistling overhead, a thin, reedy sound. An instant later, I see a flash as a missile hits a house on the bank of the Una, on my home side of the bridge. The sound of the explosion comes an instant later, and I stand frozen, bizarrely thinking about physics, about the relative speed of light and sound that cleaves the experience in two. First, the sight of fire and flame, then disconnected by a second or two, sound waves that roll over me like messengers eager to bear bad news. I hear another missile overhead, launched from the mountains surrounding our town. Someone told Tata, who told me in turn, the bomb that you hear is not the one with your name on it. If you hear it whistle, it is because it is flying over your head to somewhere else. You never hear a whisper from the bomb that kills you. The air raid siren starts its high-pitched howl then. We have no radar, nothing to tell us that the missiles are inbound. So the siren is a joke. It just serves to remind us that people are being killed. It gives no warning, just wails and mourns with the rest of us. Davor and I find each other again. We're still frozen in place, not knowing if we're about to die, but our eyes meet across the bridge. Between us, I see the mother and her little boy, the girl in the green sweater, a trio of middle-aged women who look like sisters. Davor takes a step toward me. Then the air seems to be sucked out of the world as I'm hit with an earth-shattering, deafening explosion. There's a flash between Davor and me, and I am blinded. Metal and stone are flying around me. I turn to run, and it's only when my legs are moving that I realize I'm not dead. I only make it a few steps before I fall, scraping my knees. In the dust and chaos, I hear screams, and I drag myself to my feet, stunned. My ears are ringing, and the air is choked with dust. I smell smoke. I taste smoke. There's grit on my tongue. The blue bridge is still standing. The bomb struck a glancing blow that didn't do anything much to the structure, but the pedestrians on the bridge. Against every survival instinct, I make myself walk back toward the other end of the bridge. I look all around, but don't see Davor. The little boy, the one who wanted to look at fish over the side of the bridge, is standing in the middle of a cloud of masonry dust. His mouth is open, and at first I think the sound he's making is part of the loud ringing in my ears, because everything sounds weirdly muffled at first. The sounds are returning to my ears one at a time. Then I realize he's screaming, a long, drawn-out, terrible cry that stops only when he's out of breath, then starts again after a ragged gasp. I go to him. He's blonde, tassel-haired, and blue-eyed, just like Dino when he was younger. But his little face looks impossibly old. I wish he could be confused. I wish he didn't know exactly what just happened. But this little boy understands his loss, and he's suffused with helpless, inarticulate rage. I go to him, reaching out my hand. He just stares at me with his prematurely aged face. I look beyond him. Blood on a stylish suit, the fox fur collar made from a whole fox, its sharp white teeth grinning as it grasps its own tail. Its black glass eyes are staring at me. Above that, nothing. There's nothing where his mother's head should be. He finds words now, and his screams turn into a desperate wail for his mother. He's not looking at her, but he must have seen. He's calling to her like his words could turn back time, undo the bomb. Like if he begs the universe loudly enough, he can make his mother alive again. I take his little hand, and he looks at me like I'm an alien thing. I try to lead him off the bridge, but he's like a boulder, immovable. All this time, he never stops screaming his feral fury against the world. An old man staggers beside us. A couple clings to each other as they walk through the smoke, though it is midday. The smoke and dust make it look like a foggy evening. Survivors are like ghosts in the haze. I still don't see Davor, not among the bodies or the survivors. The little boy's grief shatters me. There's nothing I can do. So I leave him. It's a wrenching decision, but someone will come to help him. I look at the other people on the bridge. The three middle-aged sisters are strewn about like old clothes. That's what I see. Their old lady sweaters and their sensible shoes. A man is hanging half of the bridge draped over the rail. Blood is dripping in a puddle at his feet. Then I see the girl in the green sweater like mine. She's on the ground, curled on her side, facing away from me. Her sweater is perfectly clean and tidy, like she just decided to take a nap in this odd place. I think she's unconscious. Maybe she was knocked out by the shock wave. I kneel at her side and take her shoulder, gently turning her over as I say, "Don't worry, I'm here. I'll help you." I roll her and find a bloody horror. The front of her body is stripped of clothes, stripped of skin, shredded from a hail of metal and stone shrapnel. From the front, she doesn't look human. She looks like meat. I scream and scramble backward on my hands and feet like a crab, wiping my bloody hands on the ground that they make a red paste with the dust. I roll to my knees, hold myself to my feet, look around for somebody, anybody who can do something. Suddenly, there are lights up ahead in the middle of the road where we're walking. It's a big square white lorry with tall blue letters on the side. UN. The United Nations is supposed to be here to help the suffering, to facilitate peace. With a gasp of relief, I run to meet the truck, waving my hand to stop them. Help is here, I shout to the little boy as I pass him. These men will help you. I'm standing in the middle of the road, right in the truck's path. It slows. The driver sees me. He meets my eye. Please have medics. I think, please have some kind counselor who can take care of this poor child. Please have someone to compassionately tend to that poor girl's body to cover her ravaged face. But the UN truck swerves around me, increasing speed. Okay, I think. They're going to the wounded in the center of the bridge. But the truck doesn't stop. It drives fast enough to make the damaged bridge shake. It swerves carefully around the carnage and rubble and carries on as if dead Bosnians weren't sprawled on the streets. The world is watching, and it doesn't care. Thank you. I've read this passage several hundred times since the book was first published in the fall of 2020, and it never gets easier. And I want to pose a question to all of you, and please know that there's never right or wrong answer in any of my discussions. And this even includes my classes when I teach at Columbia research methods courses on probability and statistics. I value each response, each reflection. And let's go to that question that I shared with you at the beginning of my slides. Why did I share this with you? What do you think was going through my mind that day after this scene, after this moment on the bridge? How was I seeing the world? How would you see the world if you had an experience like this? And of course, we can never be in someone else's shoes. We can hear their story and actively listen to their story. But given what I had just shared, what do you think was going through my mind as a young girl? And I'm going to go back to sharing my slides because I think it's a nice segue into really your reflection connecting to how do we find that resilience? How do we get to a point where, and this is something that I personally have learned about myself, where one is emptied of any kind of temptation to hate back in response to the pain or grievance that they feel. And that is some of the work that I do today. So here to walk us through a couple of insights that I think will help answer that very complex question, John, that you raised this here, just a reminder of what I had already mentioned, transformative learning theory. That transformative moment, that shock that one experiences in life compels us to self-reflect and ask the questions of how am I impacted? And it's not only impact on those who are survivors of those types of atrocities, but also those who perpetrated. How are they impacted by violence? I today study individuals who radicalize across different ideologies in order to understand how did they choose the pathway of hating and potentially inflicting targeted violence onto other groups. And then also thinking about groups who are what we refer to as referentially impacted, children of survivors, or other communities that might begin to empathize with the atrocities such as Bosnian genocide. And that often leads to self-reflection that ultimately allows us to arrive at a new sense of self. I'm not the same person I was decades ago. Some parts of me remain intact, but others have transformed and changed through these experiences. And we typically arrive at a new, more complex sense of identity and positionality, prompting us to embrace new sets of behaviors, beliefs, and actions. And what I mean by that is that I no longer see identity as a category. I do not see myself only as X, Y, or Z. We see identity as a story, as a complex story that is informed by our lived experiences. So insight one that I would share with all of you is that lived experience and our positionality are integral to understanding hate and the prevention of targeted violence. And how should we think about violence and targeted violence? And again, when I speak of violence, I am not as interested in random acts of violence, but specifically in the acts of violence that target individuals because of their identity, because of their religion, because of their ethnicity, because of their race, or some other aspect of their identity that is othered, that is dehumanized, that is targeted and marginalized. And so when I think of violence, I think of this tree. I think of the roots to all forms of direct targeted violence as cultural violence. And that term was defined first by the father of peace education, Galtung, who long time ago talked about cultural violence as different narratives of racism, othering, marginalization, dehumanization that target specific groups. And it is those narratives. So this is why voice matters, words matter, stories that we tell and that we hear and that we receive are quite important in framing how we see violence. So it is those stories of dehumanization, racism, targeting that ultimately inform what we refer to as structural violence. And you can think of structural violence as the trunk of the tree, meaning all kinds of policies that might be embedded in societies and systems that may justify a particular type of violence targeting a specific group. And then what we often observe in our lives, for instance, in the United States, when someone walks into a supermarket in Buffalo, New York, where I actually spoke with educators only days after an individual walked in and killed 10 people because of the color of their skin. That kind of direct targeted violence, a physical harm that we observe, is only the outcome of the narratives of hate, which is why it's really important for stories like The Cat I Never Named or 3 Summers to be told, to prevent, to humanize, to tell the story of those who are targeted, to humanize that experience, that number that I could have become had I been killed during the genocide itself. And so this work on preventing targeted violence actually has led me to understand people who contemplate committing an act of targeted violence. I'm not going to have time to go through the entire model, and you'll see that I'm going to skip some slides, but I want to highlight a couple of things from some of the programs that we deliver, where we train educators, we train police, journalists, students, faith leaders in the United States and across the world on some of these concepts and research that we have conducted over the years at Columbia. But I'm going to share with you just a couple of insights around what I call educational displacement theory of radicalization, or theory that really explains how is it that the person transforms from playing in a sandbox in 4th or 5th grade to a young adult willing to commit an act of harm against a group that they perceive as subhuman. What is that process? What are the factors and forces to sort of lead individual through that pathway of transformation towards contemplating an act of targeted violence? And to my surprise, after speaking to, and this model is agnostic, So it's not linked to any particular ideology. It looks at hate-fueled violence and radicalization across different groups, geographies, globally here in the United States, but also beyond the United States. And what I found quite surprising, in fact, as a researcher at first, was that when I engaged with individuals who have radicalized, it became quite apparent early on that in their journeys towards radicalization, towards hate, they experienced what I call educational displacement. What is that? It is lack of storytelling, dialogue, agency, voice in the classroom, in social spaces that can trigger the sense of lack of belonging, disconnection, disengagement from the mainstream society, a feeling that they're invisible and therefore need to seek an alternative place of belonging. And when I say educational displacement, I don't refer to only experiencing this sense of invisibility in classrooms, in schools. We learn in many different spaces. And so education in this context is broadly defined as any space, whether it's media, social media, formal education, informal education, where we learn and disseminate information. And so it's often that as a result of this educational displacement, our research has found that often young people feel a sense of invisibility, sense of loneliness, lack of kinship, friendship, mentorship, peer-to-peer acceptance that ultimately leads them to seek an alternative place of belonging. So educational displacement doesn't mean that a person will inevitably radicalize or seek to inflict violence on someone else because they feel displaced in the mainstream society, but it means that we all are at a higher risk for hate in our societies if anyone feels educationally displaced. So as an educator, as a professor at the Graduate School of Education, I often think, how does educational displacement manifest in classrooms, in schools? And here I'll give you a couple of examples. It often manifests through invisibility of representation. So erasure of identities in curricular, media, social contexts. And so we often say to educators, think about who are you not seeing in your classroom? Who is invisible? And why are they invisible in your classroom? Then we think about the invisibility of voice, failure to recognize individual voices. We often tend to focus on those who speak up, those who complain, those who are very vocal, who know how to advocate, who have the confidence to use their voice, but who is not speaking and who is silent in our spaces, and why is that the case? And then also invisibility of potential. We have conducted studies that showcase that lack of mentorship in schooling spaces, in workplaces, often leads to this sense of invisibility, where some individuals may feel that their potential is not uplifted, not recognized, not visible in our shared spaces. So educational displacement is a nuanced definition of invisibility. It's not only about dropping out of school, which is a term that's often used for those who might not be doing well in school. There are plenty of students that we have surveyed and interviewed in the United States, around the world, and I'll share a few data points with you, that feel educationally displaced even though they might be top performers in the classrooms. And so educational displacement can be experienced by anyone across ethnic groups, racial groups, or religious groups, and so on. So now, in terms of sort of the pathways to that impact of hate narratives that we might witness in our society, you might wonder, okay, who is adversely impacted? Is it just those who are invisible? Are they the only ones who experience adverse effects of educational displacement? Well, our research, to summarize again for you, our research has shown that, if you remember, cultural violence that we talked about, the root causes, these narratives of hate that are roots to the targeted violence that we might see manifest, whether it's violence in Bosnia in 1990s or violence on a street in the United States where someone is targeted for their religion, ethnicity, or their race. Those narratives of hate have educational impact as an impact in educational spaces. And so who is impacted by educational displacement? An obvious group is those who are educationally displaced. So think of, I'll use myself as an example. I grew up in former Yugoslavia, where as a Bosnian Muslim, as Bosniak, I was treated differently. I was a second-class citizen, and I wanted to be the best performer in the class academically so that I could be perceived as equal, as the same as anyone else who was non-Muslim. So feeling educationally displaced, invisible in the classrooms, doing math problems or reading stories that never featured in any positive light any character with a Muslim name made me feel educationally displaced, made me feel invisible in my own community. So that's an obvious group that's impacted. Then who is the second group that's impacted? I always want to think about those who engage in educational displacement itself as well. I refer to them as educational displacers, because those who might be targeting my identity or that Amra in 1980s former Yugoslavia, they themselves are at the higher risk for engaging in actual targeted violence because they are engaging in narratives that erase Amra's identity, that make Amra feel invisible, that make Amra feel dehumanized. And so I want to highlight this, that educational displacement means it's not any one particular group that's at the higher risk for engaging in violent expression. It is actually all of us as a society, including bystanders, including those who are neither engaging in educational displacement, being inflicted upon others, or those who are educationally displaced. Now, I have 5 minutes before we finish and open it to your questions. I want to share actually a couple of data points in those next 5 minutes with you quickly. So we use both we obviously use storytelling, but we also use qualitative, quantitative approaches to studying educational displacement, studying how do we prevent targeted violence in different ways. And I'm not going to go to all of the statistics behind this chart, but I'm going to highlight for you that when you see a name of a particular variable, which is sort of the words that you're seeing to your right on the screen, if you see a star, it means it's a significant variable in predicting one's belonging in society, or inverse of that, one's level of educational displacement. So for instance, in one study, we looked at social belonging regressed on one's racial ethnic background. And this was a study conducted here in the United States. And what we found initially is that actually it is family income, it's economic grievances, it's economic inequality that can lead to a sense of lacking belonging. And initially, when we looked at the racial composition, ethnic composition, religious background, we didn't actually find these variables to be significant in predicting lack of social belonging. And a lot of people ask, oh, how is that possible? We thought that there's racism towards this group or that group, and therefore they would feel a lack of belonging. Well, let me expand on that, kind of complicate this model and share with you the next set of analysis on the same data. So when we actually included the variables that represent teacher bias efficacy, school staff bias efficacy, experiences of bias in schools, and these variables sort of capture whether school was effective in addressing biased speech or language or behavior in school, or whether teachers were effective in doing so, and what kind of harmful biased language or behavior or actions a student might have experienced in school. When we included those variables, it became quite apparent that actually our sense of belonging in schools is predicted by the experience of bias and prejudice towards a particular religious, ethnic, or racial identity. So to put it simply, again, using myself as an easy hypothetical example, it's not Amra in 1980s former Yugoslavia that, because of her Bosnian Muslim background, felt invisible or felt a lack of belonging simply because of that identity. It is how I was treated or mistreated for that identity that led to the lack of social belonging. And so that's really important for us to think about for anyone who is engaging in bringing communities together, that it is not any one of our identities that makes us feel displaced. It is how our identities might be mistreated by those in our communities that ultimately lead to that lack of belonging. Let me share with you another data point. And this study, and I'll share at the end QR code where you can actually go through some of our projects and research and access our studies. This study is actually in press currently, is about to be published. And here we actually looked at more than 500,000 surveys of students across 68 countries, and United Kingdom, as well as the United States, is included. And what we looked at was this question of being able to express your grievances in schooling spaces. Does that actually impact positively or negatively young people's sense of belonging? What we found is that the greater access to freedom of speech, to civil rights, to being able to express yourself on equal terms as anyone else, being able to share your testimony, the way that I just shared my testimony of surviving the Bosnian Genocide, that actually allows students to build a sense of belonging. And this was valid finding across all 68 countries. This was also a finding that was valid across different type of immigrant backgrounds. So Native students, second generation and first generation students. And in particular, the effect was strong for second generation students. So across different immigrant or non-immigrant backgrounds, across different countries, and here are the countries if you want to take a moment to take a look at which countries were included, largely OECD countries and additional where we could obtain data. These are large data sets, cross-national data sets that have been collected at the national level that we, in essence, use to more deeply understand what can help us build a sense of belonging. And so ability to engage in genuine dialogue, ability to express one's thoughts and feelings and grievances in non-violent ways, in fact, helps us build stronger communities and a stronger sense of belonging. So with that, I'm actually we're not going to have enough time to share all these slides. You can see that I prepared quite a bit. I always do that just in case we have more time. But just to reiterate a couple of key insights. One, people don't radicalize based on their facile desire to hurt other human beings. They radicalize and begin to hate through a much more nuanced process that is triggered by sense of invisibility, dehumanization, grievances. And whether grievances are real or perceived may matter to us who study them, but doesn't matter to those who feel them. So we need to find constructive, non-violent ways to address those grievances to lessen hate in our societies. And then the next insight, which I had shared data on with you, is that individuals' racial, religious, ethnic identity itself does not determine their sense of belonging. Rather, it is by speech and behavior targeting their identity that affects their sense of displacement. And educational displacement doesn't mean that an individual will radicalize or violently express their grievances, but it means, as I had showed in that one visual, it means that we are collectively at a higher risk of hate and hate-fueled violence. And access to freedom of expression and civil liberties is quite important to enhance a sense of belonging in schools. And in order to address educational displacement, it is essential that we work on building collective resilience to hate. And I'm going to stop there, and I'm just going to share, here are some of our publications that I've used for this presentation, but here's a QR code for those of you who are interested. Thank you, everyone.